Good evening. Welcome to the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies Winter Webinar Series, the Jewish Studies Seminar, the Jewish People and the Church. My name is Bonnie Shafrin, and I'm director of the Lux Center at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, and I will serve as the moderator for this program. If this is the first time that you're attending a Lux Center program, we're so glad you're here. The Lux Center is proud to be the only program for Catholic Jewish studies to be located within a Roman Catholic seminary. It is our mission to strengthen the living relationship between Catholics and the Jewish people by first providing seminarians with the educational experiences that will offer them a positive understanding of Catholic-Jewish relations and the ability to engage in interreligious activities in their congregations after ordination. The Lux Center also offers programs such as this one to the larger community. I wish to express my sincere thanks to Brittany Hager-McNeely for lending her time and technological expertise to ensure that this webinar works seamlessly, and we expect that it will. I thank Father Raul Gomez, President Rector of Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, for his encouragement and support. The priests of the Sacred Heart who support the Lux Center in so many ways, and to the Harry Hoffman Family Foundation for granting us the funds to enable this program to be presented to you this evening. And of course, I thank all of you for registering and attending tonight's lecture. Because of the way our Zoom account was set up, the number of registrants for this session was cut off when the registration reached 100. So we know we have at least 100 people out there. We're so glad to see you. If you know anyone who attempted to register and was able to do so, we apologize. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Lux Center website sometime next week, so they can check it out, or if you want to see it again, you can do it that way. And I will let you know that the upcoming webinars that we have scheduled, we will have a capacity for more than 100 if that many people register. So the Lux Center is able to do the work necessary to fulfill its mission with the financial support of individuals like you and grants from private foundations. If you appreciate what we do, we ask you to go to the Lux Center web pages, click on How Can We Help, and consider making a donation to the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. We are pleased to present this Jewish Studies Seminar series that addresses the answers to questions that as Christians you might have thought about but were too afraid to ask. As members of the audience, you will have the privilege to listen to the words of our learned scholar and submit questions via the Q&A feature that you will find on the bottom of your screen. If you click on the Q&A, you can type in your question at any time during the presentation. And after our speaker's presentation, there will be time for me to choose some of your questions for our speaker to address. Tonight, January 27th, happens to be the beginning of a minor festival on the Jewish calendar called Tu B'Shvat, which literally means the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Shabbat. Another name for it is the New Year of the Trees. It is viewed as an appropriate occasion to educate Jews about their tradition's advocacy of responsible stewardship of God's creation. Its themes are similar to those expressed by Pope Francis in his encyclical letter Laudato Si, addressing the care for our common home. I also need to note that today has been designated by the United Nations as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This date was chosen as it marks the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp by Soviet troops on January 27th, 1945. At this time, we remember the 6 million Jewish souls who perished by the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust. With the level of anti-Semitism, disinformation, and hate speech rising both nationally and globally, It is urgent to remind ourselves that prejudice and bigotry of any sort should not be tolerated. The topic for tonight's session is, what do Jews believe about God? It will be presented by Rabbi Scott Shafrin, the Associate Rabbi and Religious School Director at Congregation Kol Rina, a synagogue of the conservative movement of Judaism in St. Louis, Missouri. Rabbi Shafrin is a Milwaukee native and a graduate of Brandeis University with a master's degree in education from the Fingerhut School of Education and a rabbinic ordination from the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, both at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. It is an honor and a privilege to have known Rabbi Shafrin for a very long time. In fact, maybe longer than anyone else that he knows. He is married to Rabbi Jessica Shafrin, who's also a conservative rabbi in St. Louis. But most importantly, he is the father of my two darling grandsons. I know you will enjoy learning about what Jews believe about God with Rabbi Scott Shafrin. Feel free to type in your questions at any time during the session. Questions will be answered after our speaker finishes his presentation. And I now welcome Rabbi Scott Shafrin.
Thank you so much, and thank you also to all of you for being here, and to the Lux Center and to Sacred Heart for having me here today. I want to just re-emphasize that what we're going to be talking about today, this topic of what do Jews believe about God, is a big one, and I will try to define the words that I use, especially words that may not be in English, as carefully as possible, and I will try to explain all of the concepts or people or things to which I refer in as clear a way as possible. But I can 100% guarantee that some of you will have questions as we go along. Please, please feel free to type those in to the question box. We're going to have a lot of time towards the end to answer some questions. And there is no question you can ask that is out of bounds. There is no question that should be seen as taboo. I want to make sure that this is informative for you and that it can help your own understanding of some of my culture. And the best way to do that is by asking the questions. So the topic of what do Jews believe about God is a really important one to me. As a rabbi, I have thought a lot about what do Jews believe about God. And there's a lot of different ways to answer this. So the first thing I want to sort of share with all of you is a little bit about how Jewish people throughout history think in general, and then specifically what we think about God. The framework I'm going to work with tonight is to present a little bit of insight into how Jewish peoplehood is organized, how we, kind of group ourselves today into different movements or ways of thinking, and then throughout history, how some of our great thinkers have tackled this question of how we relate to God and how do we understand God within our Jewish framework. So, what do Jews believe about God? The short answer is lots of things. And I know for some people that is confusing, but let me explain. Judaism as a religion has always had a very powerful bent towards doing over believing. That the actions are seen as primary, whereas belief is somewhat secondary. And this comes even from our earliest texts. If you look at the book of Exodus, in chapter 24, verse 7, when the people are at Mount Sinai and they're receiving from God the first of the commandments, the first thing that the people respond famously in the Hebrew is Na'aseh v'nishma. God has given us these commandments, and all that God says to us, we will do and we will hear. Literally is how that translates. But the way that our tradition understands that is we will do, and then after we do, we will understand. After we do, we will learn. After we do, we will believe, which are all definitions for that word nishma, both to listen, to learn, to hear, and to believe. So there's this explanation of this in a 13th century Spanish work called Sefer HaChinuch. And here is what the author, who is anonymous, kind of uses as examples to explain this philosophy. It says, a person is acted upon according to their own actions, and their heart and their thoughts always follow after the actions they do, whether good or bad. So this is saying, if you tend to do things that are good, you will keep doing things that are good. That makes you a good person, the actions you do. Whether good or bad. And even the one who in their heart is a complete sinner, meaning they have terrible thoughts and desires and all of these things, and the desires for their hearts are only for evil. If their spirit shall be enlightened and they put their efforts and actions to persist in Torah and mitzvot, mitzvot are God's commandments, that's the Hebrew term for God's commandments, even if not for the sake of heaven, they shall immediately incline towards good. And from that which is not for its own sake, that which is for its own sake as a personal gain, for their heart is drawn after their actions. Meaning, if someone has sinful desires in their heart, but never acts on them and only does what they're supposed to, they're considered a righteous person. If, on the other hand, a person has righteous thoughts and desires, and their heart is straight and innocent, desiring of Torah and mitzvot, but they shall constantly deal with improper things, eventually from their righteousness they shall have become completely evil, for it is known and true that every person is acted upon according to their actions. So what Sefer HaChinuch here is kind of pointing out is that it's not that belief or what's in your heart is unimportant, but it's what you do and say in the world that's actually most important. And this is played out over and over again throughout Jewish tradition. So that's one point, this idea of acting as being primary over believing. A second point is that even what Jews do believe is always multifaceted. There is a saying that the rabbis of the Talmud, one of the first collections of Jewish law and stories after the closing of the Jewish Bible, so this is around the 6th century of the Common Era, the rabbis of the Talmud say that Jewish wisdom has 70 faces, meaning you can turn it and turn it and turn it again and find new interpretations, and that all of those are valid ways of looking at Jewish tradition, even valid ways of looking at God. And no piece of text summarizes this better than this piece here from the Babylonian Talmud. It's from a tractate, a section called Ta'anit, which deals with primarily with a holiday called Purim, which is coming up in about a month, but also deals with other fast days. And here's what the discussion here is, what is the point of studying with a partner? Like, why do you do that? Why would you, study with somebody as opposed to studying alone? And here's what it says. The Talmud cites many other debates that deal with Torah study. Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, What is the meaning of that which is written? Just as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. That's a quote from the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 17. This verse comes to tell you that just as with these iron implements, one sharpens another when they are rubbed against each other, so too, when Torah scholars study together, they sharpen one another in halakha, which is the Hebrew term meaning Jewish law or ethical traditions. And so what it's really saying here is that just learning what the text of the Bible says is not enough, that there's layers, textures, that the words, even when they are clear, when you know what the meaning of each word means, the way to apply it to your life is really only understood when you're debating it. In fact, in the ancient world, when the first rabbis came around the turn of the Common Era, the training, the final test to become a rabbi was they gave you a certain situation, a certain Jewish legal situation, and you had to make 40 arguments for one side and 40 arguments for another. This is all to say that Jewish understanding of any concept, especially the big important concepts, is always going to be multifaceted. There is almost nothing within Jewish tradition that is dogmatic, that all Jews believe with perfect faith. Everything has nuance. Everything is seen as able to be questioned and debated. And it's in the questioning that Jewish people throughout history have developed their spiritual sensibilities. So that's the scene I want to kind of set. all of the perspectives that I'm going to present about what Jews think God is or how we relate to God are from mainstream Jewish scholars throughout history, are readily accepted by many Jewish people, but none of them is the one thing that Jews think. In fact, anytime someone asks, what does Judaism say about a certain topic? The answer is always going to be a multifaceted answer. But I want to take a look at some of those things right now. And the best way to understand that is to understand that there's a lot of different organizations in the modern world of how Jews organize themselves. So there are a few major movements of Judaism. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. If you have questions about the movements of Judaism, we can certainly pick that up towards the end as well. But there's a few major categories that Jews organize into in 2021. One is the Reform movement. So before the turn of the 1900s, Jews were just organized into different communities that had, their own local practices and customs. But there wasn't formal movements, there wasn't formal denominations until really in Germany in the mid to late 1800s. A group of Jews spun off from kind of the ancient tradition and said, we want to be more in the Enlightenment, we want to be more rational thinkers, we want to be unbound from some of these traditional strictures, and formed the Reform movement first in Germany and then here in the United States. The idea of the Reform movement was to reform the Jewish practice and to make it a little bit more flexible, liberal thinking. And so the movement ended up kind of emphasizing this idea of Jewish ethics and spirituality over kind of the strictures of individual Jewish laws or the system of Jewish law, which again we call halakha. In reaction to that, the Orthodox movement formed. And the Orthodox Jewish movement has a lot of subgroupings, but in general, the Orthodox Jewish movements all are connected by this idea that Jewish law is more unchanging than it is changing, than it is malleable, and that the focus of their communities is on preserving that legacy, preserving certain customs, preserving certain ways of eating, living, observing holidays, and really connecting to that Jewish legal tradition. So about half a century later, the conservative movement was founded here in America. Worldwide, it's known as Masorti, which is the Hebrew word for traditional Judaism. And it's the movement it was the movement I was ordained in. It's the movement my synagogue belongs to. And the idea was that the Reform movement in the 1940s had kind of swung very far away from tradition, and most Orthodox movements were very, very stuck in the Judaism of the 1700s. And so conservative Judaism saw itself as a bridge between the modern world and Jewish law, and really saw itself as the inheritors of the rabbis of the ancient world, specifically the rabbis of the Talmud, who innovated and took very seriously Jewish observance, but also took very seriously the questions of their own modern world and therefore our modern world as well. So most conservative thinkers have a way of taking the tradition that they learned and on which they stand and finding ways to integrate that into modern life. There's also something called Reconstructionist Judaism, which was founded by an American thinker named Mordechai Kaplan around the turn of the 20th century. And basically, Reconstructionism is this idea that Jewish tradition and Jewish peoplehood is constantly evolving, and so whatever communities do is the right thing to do. Jewish renewal is sort of a renewal of orthodoxy in that it takes the kind of spiritual excitement and energy of certain sects of Orthodox Judaism and combines it with progressive ideas and ritual diversity. So those are some of the major movements of Judaism, and most Jews fall into one of those categories or kind of a mixture of many of them. So like I said before, there's not a lot of dogmatic principles within Jewish tradition. That's not to say there's not a lot of legal principles. There are an unending number of legal principles. The basic understanding that Jews traditionally have of Torah, of our core biblical texts, is that there's 613 commandments in the Torah, which is a lot. And some of them are fairly obvious and would be recognizable to you, like the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, honor thy father and mother. But there's more specific ones too, like when you own a field that you're growing things in, you leave the corners ungleaned so that anyone who is poor or needy can come and take from the corners of your field. It's a process called leket is the Hebrew word for that. And so there's Jewish commandments that govern every facet of Jewish life. But at the same time, those are, again, things you do, not so much things you believe. There was a thinker whose name was Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived in Spain in the 10th century. He was a brilliant thinker, one of the kind of major Jewish philosophers of any point in Jewish history. He is one of the few thinkers who wrote commentaries on the Bible and also on the works of the rabbis, and it is kind of well known for his visionary understanding of human nature, but also Jewish tradition. And he's really the first person to take a stab at trying to create principles of faith, articles that are simple to understand and that kind of cover the spectrum of what Jewish people believe. And by the way, this is the 10th century, so this is 1,000 years ago. Judaism had already existed for 3,000 years before somebody tries to take a stab at creating some dogmatic principles, which is pretty astounding. But it kind of tells you a lot about where Jewish people as a community are and where Jewish thought is. So here's what Maimonides came up with. They're called his 13 principles of faith. There are 13 of them. And a lot of them deal with kind of issues of belief. So here's how he separates things out. I believe that the Creator is the creator and guide for all created things. God alone has made, makes, and will make all that is created. So this is a way of saying all of the things in the world are created by God in some way, shape, or form, and that there's no other first cause. God is the first cause and the continuer of creation. Number 2, I believe that the Creator is a unity and that there is no union in any way like God. Adonai, so that's the Hebrew name for God, which literally means my master or my Lord. Adonai alone is our God, who was, who is, and who will be. So this is a way of saying that Jewish people believe in one God, that there is one creator of the universe that is a universal God, and that Jewish people have a particular way of relating to that deity. I believe that the Creator is not a body, not affected by physical nature, and nothing whatsoever can compare to God or be compared with God. So Maimonides was well known for what's called negative theology, which is a way of saying God is so beyond human understanding that anything you could possibly say about God is actually saying an opposite. So if you say God is totally good, what you're saying is God is not capricious or cruel. If you say God is infinite, what you're saying is God is not limited like people are limited. So you can't really, as a human being, understand God the way you understand like a water bottle. I understand this water bottle. I can see it and touch it, and I know its dimensions. But God is wholly different than anything you can physically understand. So it's divorcing God from the physical world in some way, that God is different than the physical world. Number 4, I believe that the Creator is the first and the last. This is very popular within most Western religions. God is before creation, God will endure after creation and the universe end. I believe that the Creator alone is fitting to make prayer to, and to another prayer shall not be made. So this is saying Jews only pray to God. Jews in the time of the Bible, there's a lot of friction about idol worship or praying to a pantheon of other gods. And it's one of the cardinal kind of Jewish biblical sins is to be praying to specifically to an idol, to like a stone carving of a deity, but also just that you understand that the one to whom you address your prayers is the one God. I believe that all the words of the prophets are true. So throughout the Jewish Bible, there are 55 named, recorded people who come under the heading as prophets. Some of them have their own books, like Jeremiah and Isaiah. Some of them are other famous characters who do prophetic works, like Moses or Abraham. But what my mind is saying is that I believe that prophets were prophets, and what they said actually happened. I believe in the prophecy of Moses, our teacher, and that he was the father of all the prophets that preceded him, as well as all that came after him. So this is kind of a particular point of Jewish understanding. Moses is seen as like the greatest leader in the Jewish biblical tradition. Not only freeing the Jewish people from Egypt, but also just this idea that Moses taught Jews how to be Jewish. That before Moses, they weren't really Jewish people. They were this nomadic tribe of kind of loosely related families. But after Moses, they become this nation. They become this people who has traditions and laws and ways to distinguish themselves from other peoples. Number 8, I believe that the whole Torah now found in our hands is the exact same one given to Moses. May peace rest upon him. I believe that this is the Torah, and it shall not be changed or replaced with another from the Creator. Blessed be God. So this is a principle that is specifically trying to separate Judaism from Christianity and Islam, both of which, especially during the time of Maimonides, this is the 10th century, were each claiming to be new covenants that kind of replaced the Jewish covenant. I believe the Creator knows every action done by a human being as well as their thoughts. This is ascribing to God omnipotence and omniscience. I believe that the Creator rewards all those who keep God's commandments and punish all those who transgress God's commands. This is, talking about theodicy, talking about kind of reward and punishment, which is, as you can imagine, a very popular thing to think about and talk about. It's a difficult and complicated one because we could all think of examples where things don't seem to accord exactly to that. And it gets into dangerous territory of, blaming people for their own misfortunes for things that are probably not their fault. Number 12, I believe in the coming of the Messiah, and though he may tarry in waiting, in spite of that, I will wait expectantly for him to come each day. So a core principle of sort of Jewish thought for the last 3,000 years is really this idea that at some future point, a messianic figure who's descended from the line of King David will come and the world will be redeemed in some way. There's a lot of different visions in a lot of the different prophets and in the subsequent rabbinic writings about exactly how and when and what that will look like. But there is this idea that at a certain point we're working towards a messianic vision of the world, but Jews have a very particular way of looking at that. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century, his name is Simon Greenberg, has this piece where he kind of does a play on this and says, I wait every day for the Messiah to come, but I don't wait with my hands folded in my lap. I wait while visiting the sick. I wait while feeding the hungry. I wait while clothing the naked. And I hope that one day I will create a world that's worthy of the Messiah coming. So this idea that human beings and God are partners in creating a better world, and that, if we work to make the world this vision of a holy place, then that's a world that's worthy of having itself redeemed. And the last one, I believe that there will be a resurrection of the dead at a time that will be pleasing for the Creator, and the remembrance of God will be exalted forever and all eternity. So this is part of that same messianic vision that at some point, it's very unclear, by the way, exactly what this means, whether that means everyone who's ever lived will be populating this planet, or whether the entirety of creation will be fundamentally altered and there will be some sort of vast, different messianic world. So these are principles of faith. And I went through all of them in detail because I wanted to give a basis for our learning and discussion, but I also want to say these are not principles of faith that a Jewish person is required to accept, nor does every Jewish person accept these 13 principles of faith. There is no test when you're born into a Jewish family, do you accept these things? In fact, the rabbis go so far as to say if you are born Jewish or convert to Judaism, you're Jewish forever, no matter what you do. That you cannot be un-Jewish. You can be not very observant in your traditional observance. You can be a not good person. There's certainly lots of things you can do to be a not good person. You can be ethically or morally, doing wrong actions. But there's nothing you can believe that takes you out of the realm of being Jewish. It's because it's not only a religion, it's also a culture, it's also a peoplehood, and it's also a community into which you are fully immersed. So I wanted to take a look now at a few specific thinkers, some major thinkers throughout Jewish history, and what they have to say about God. Because I think you'll find that many of our thinkers have a little bit of different takes on both how we relate to God and also what is the nature of God. So we're going to jump around to those. The first one I wanted to look at is a thinker called the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who is the founder of Hasidism. And if you've never heard that word before, Hasidism is a sect of Orthodox Judaism founded in the early part of the 1700s. And its kind of understanding of the world is that the primary Jewish mode of operation is supposed to be joy. That joy is how you should enter your day, joy is how you should interact with other humans, and joy is definitely how you should interact with the creator of the world. So this is what the Baal Shem Tov has to say about God. Envision that the creator whose glory fills the earth, God and God's presence are continually with you, meaning all the time the presence of God fills every part of the universe. This is the most subtle of all experiences. Tell yourself, God is the master of all that occurs in the world. God can do anything I desire, and therefore it makes no sense for me to put my confidence in anything else but God. Meaning, don't put your confidence in people, don't put your confidence in governments, put only your faith and connection in God. Therefore, rejoice constantly. Ponder and believe with complete faith that the divine presence is with you and protecting you, that you are bound up with the Creator and that the Creator is bound up with you, with your every limb and faculty, that your focus is fixed on the Creator and the Creator's focus fixed on you. And the Creator could do whatever God wants. If God so desired, God could annihilate all the worlds in a single moment and recreate them in a single moment. Within God are rooted all goodness and all stern judgments in the world. So this is a way of saying everything is a part of God and God is infused into everything. Every molecule of the universe, every action we do, all of history is all part and parcel of God. And therefore, all the actions we take should be with that in mind. Should be with kind of this focus on God connectedness. So that's kind of how the Hasidic approach is. And if you ever have the chance, I highly encourage you, if you ever have the chance to go to a Hasidic Jewish service, there's a lot of singing. There's even dancing in the aisles. It is very infused with joy. And so that's kind of their mode of operating based on kind of the thinking of the Baal Shem Tov and his later disciples. So that's one way of understanding God. And that may sound familiar to some of you. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik was sort of another end of the spectrum, also an Orthodox rabbi, but a kind of modern Orthodox rabbi who wrote a famous book called The Halachic Man, which was all about the philosophy of understanding a modern Jewish, thoughtful human and how they spiritually relate to the world. And so here's what he says about God. He says two different things that seem almost opposite. The way of every Jew to God must not differ from the trail along which Abraham moved toward his destiny, which had to be blazed through the wilderness of brute and nonsensical existence. So I don't want to assume any knowledge, but Abraham, if you look through the stories in the book of Genesis, had a fairly arduous life, even though he also had this special relationship with God. Abraham's first interaction with God was he was told to leave the home that he knew, the land of his birth, his father's house, when he was in his 80s, and go to a place that God didn't tell him about, to a place where I will show you, is what God says. And throughout his life, he has these different trials. The rabbis count 10 different trials of Abraham, and it's fairly brutal. It's fairly difficult, even though he's considered one of these amazing biblical figures and one of these kind of prophetic examples for the Jewish people. Rabbi Soloveitchik continues, the experience is attained at the cost of doubts and a restless life, searching and examining, striving and pursuing, and not finding. That's the key. We're going to come back to that in a second. Of frustrating efforts with almost hopeless waiting, of grappling with oneself and with everybody else, of exploring a starlit and moonless sky and watching the majesty of sunsets and sunrise, the beauty and birth and also the ugliness of death and destruction, of trying to penetrate behind the mechanical surface of cosmic occurrence and failing to discover any intelligible order in this drama, of winning and losing yet surging forward again, of conquering, giving up, and reaching out again, of being able to put on a repeat performance of something which I had and lost, of asking questions and not finding the answers, of ascending the high mountain like Moses and falling back into the abyss, shattering everything one has received, yet pulling oneself out of the depths of misery, and trying to climb up the mountain again with 2 new stone tablets. So what he's saying here is the journey of a person relating to God is a frustrating journey. It's a journey of wanting to know God, but realizing you can never know God. It's trying to figure out what God is, and at the same time understanding that you are, mortally limited in your perception of things, and you might only ever get a piece of connection and understanding with the infinite God. And yet, Rabbi Soloveitchik specifically says it's that process of questioning, of doubting, of investigating why you doubt that ultimately leads a person towards a spiritual life. But that does not lead you to a clear and kind of dogmatic, faithful understanding of God. Because what he's saying is, in essence, the questions are the most important part of the journey, not the security of a faithful life, which is a hard thing to understand and a harder thing to do. It's, as he's spelling it out, it sounds difficult and painful, and kind of unanimously the rabbis say, yeah, that's what life is. It's not that it's bad. Actually, the struggles can be beautiful, and that's how you understand things, is by pushing yourself, is by investigating your world, is by looking around and asking questions. Because if you never ask the questions, you're never going to fully understand. You're only going to accept without really knowing. But he goes one step further. He says the following, also in his book Halachic Man. Neither ritual decisions nor political leadership constitutes the main task of a halachic man or a spiritual person. Far from it. The actualization of the ideals of justice and righteousness is that pillar of fire which halachic man follows when he, as a rabbi and a teacher in Israel, serves his community. So here he's saying the same thing as our rabbi said in the Talmud, that it's not the spiritual quest, it's not even living up to the Jewish commandments or being a good leader that makes you a spiritual person. It's pursuing justice. It's specifically doing those commands which help other people and which make the world better, which makes you a spiritual person. And that's kind of an idea that cuts through a lot of different streams of Jewish thought, that making the world better is a way of being God's partner in the world, and that not only is that a spiritual act, it is the main action for which people were created. And that not doing that is not only kind of pulling oneself further away from God, it's actually shirking a responsibility that each of us have. Famously in the Mishnah, which is an earlier code of Jewish law written around the 2nd century of the Common Era, in a tractate called Avot, the rabbis say, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor velo ata lihibatel ben horin mimena, that you are not, that it's not your job to complete all the work, but neither are you free to desist from doing any of it, which is kind of what Rabbi Soloveitchik here is saying. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan was famously, as I said before, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. And Reconstructionist theology is very particular because it's one of the few streams of Judaism that doesn't see God as an entity. It talks about God as a force or a power. So that God is sort of the animating force of the universe, but not an entity that acts independently. That the universe was set up in a certain way, and God is the animating force behind all of that universe. But here's what Rabbi Kaplan says about God in his own words. God is the power that makes for salvation. God is the sum of the animating, organizing forces and relationships which are forever making a cosmos out of chaos. We learn more about God when we say that love is divine than when we say that God is love. A veritable transformation takes place. Divinity becomes relevant to authentic experience, and therefore takes on a definiteness which is accompanied by an awareness of authenticity. So what he's saying is, saying things about God only helps you intellectually. It's only when you understand that doing the good and ethical actions in the world is godly, is godlike, that it adds meaning to your life and that actually connects you to that animating force of the universe. So it's through the actions of doing, what you think is a godly action. So, the rabbis of the Jewish tradition talk a lot about, just like God in the Bible visits the sick, so shall we visit the sick. Just like God, feeds the hungry or cares for the poor or clothes the naked, so should we do those things. And so what Rabbi Kaplan here is saying is, do the things that our tradition tells us God would do, and that makes you a more spiritually connected person and living the life that God wants you to live. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was an incredible thinker of the 20th century and was famously known for his amazing pursuit of justice, specifically in the civil rights movement. There's a lot of famous pictures of Rabbi Heschel marching at Selma and at the March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his idea of God is something that he calls radical amazement. That a spiritual life is one in which the individual is constantly looking at the world around him and nothing is mundane. Everything is fantastic and miraculous, because what he says is, in essence, everything is. If the world and the universe is infused with God's essence, then everything is a miracle. And that's how ideally we would like to live our lives. Obviously, that's a little difficult. It's hard when you're, ringing up an order with a cashier to see that interaction as miraculous. Although I would argue if you're buying a cup of coffee and it's your first cup of coffee after a night of no sleep, that cup of coffee can be miraculous. So here's what Rabbi Heschel has to say about God and the spiritual quest. It's customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in a modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, meaning refuted by science, but because it became irrelevant, or dull, or oppressive, or insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. It's a very bold statement. What he's saying is that doctrine that doesn't inspire is just words, and that prayers that are not felt in the deepest part of your heart are just moving air. That the whole point of religion is to inspire an active connection both to God but also to the world and to yourself, and that connection needs to be ever maintained and ever growing. And he kind of says that a little bit more. So first I want to say that first quote is from Rabbi Heschel's most famous work, which is called God in Search of Man. If you ever have a chance, I highly recommend reading it, although I will say it is very long, and each section is very distinct and kind of hard to read, although English was, I think, his fourth language that he learned. So we can forgive him for that. But the fact that he called his work God in Search of Man kind of tells you a lot about his thinking right there. That his idea was that God's constantly there, constantly reaching out and wanting to build a spiritual relationship with every person, but that it takes people to be in that state of radical amazement in order to kind of build that bridge. And one of the ways he talks about that throughout his thinking is with prayer, because that's generally how people think about talking with God is through prayer. So he says the primary purpose of prayer is not to make requests. It's one of my favorite things to say. The primary purpose of prayer is not to make requests. The primary purpose is to praise, to sing, to chant. Because the essence of prayer is a song, and man cannot live without a song. Prayer may not save us, but prayer may make us worthy of being saved. Prayer is to dream in league with God, to envision God's holy visions. It's a beautiful sentiment, because a person who prays only for their own needs in the eyes of Rabbi Heschel is just like a kid who asks their parents for presents. It's begging and pleading, but not feeling that joy, not feeling that connection, not feeling that relationship or that essence of God in everything you do. And what he's saying, by the way, also is that prayers for requests are an important part of prayer life. But too often, people, when you think of the word prayer, people think of making requests. And if you look actually at a Jewish worship service, a traditional Jewish prayer book, most of the prayers are not requests. Most of them are prayers of gratitude or, kind of praising God in some way or another. So that's kind of his way of relating to that as well. I want to go through just one or two more, and then I'm going to kind of sum things together, and we'll take some questions. Rabbi Harold Schulweis was a brilliant scholar and thinker. He was the head rabbi at a synagogue in Los Angeles called Valley Beth Shalom, which is a huge conservative Jewish synagogue out in Los Angeles. I had the privilege of learning with him before he passed away, and he was just an incredible thinker. And he talked about God as a predicate, God not as a noun, but as a verb. And here's what he had to say. Does prayer really work? Does God hear our requests? Does God care enough to intervene in our lives? If God doesn't, is it because God can't, or because God chooses not to, because God won't? That we may not magically pray for a result that defies the laws of nature or contradicts the laws of logic does not reflect God's lack of power. It acknowledges the reality that God has created. So this, by the way, is a pretty big concept within Jewish law. You're not allowed to pray for something that's impossible. So, if I am studying for a test, I can pray that I do well on the test. But once I turn that test in, however I did is how I did. And I can't get the test back and say, oh, I pray that this A, or this D turns into an A. That's what's called a bracha levatala, a prayer made for naught. And it's actually kind of a serious thing, because what you're doing is invoking God's name for something that's in vain. So you're not allowed to do that in Jewish law. And what he's saying here is that God has created a reality, and that God inhabits that reality. And here's kind of the most important point he makes. The question to be asked of those who seek God is not whether they believe in a noun that cannot be known. Meaning, we can never know God the way we know like a person, or we know other things. God is not a thing. But the question to be asked them is whether they believe in the gerunds of godliness, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, supporting the fallen, pursuing peace, living with the neighbor. That is a really powerful statement. Because what he's saying here is, it doesn't matter what you believe about God. What's important is, do you believe that healing the sick is a godly action? And if so, that imposes upon you a certain responsibility. If you believe that healing the sick is godly, then you should be healing the sick. If you believe that feeding the hungry is godly, you should be actively feeding the hungry. Whether that means physically putting food into someone's mouth, or donating time or money, or helping lobby for legislation that helps feed the hungry, whatever it is, if you think that's a godly action, then you should be doing it, which is a powerful statement as well. I wanted to talk about quickly Rabbi Bradley Shvit Artson, both because he's a wonderful scholar and the dean of my rabbinical school, and also because he coined a term really within Judaism called process theology. And process theology is this idea that we ascribe to God certain things that sometimes make God less knowable. But that if you look at the writings of the Jewish tradition, it describes God as intimately intertwined with the lives of people, with individual people, whether it be Abraham or Moses or other figures in the biblical canon, but also with every person. And I wanted to read this last part because I think it kind of explains his thinking, that God is not wholly unknowable and perfect in that way that we can't understand, but that God is primarily in relationship with people. It says, just as our suffering pains God, God is diminished by our not rising to make the best choice. The God of Israel is not merely an unchanging external perfection, although there is an aspect of God that is unchanging and eternal. Rather, we encountered the divine in the dynamism of Brit, of a covenant. There is a dynamic interconnection between God, humanity, and all creation. And what he's saying here is something incredible and radical, that God changes as we change. That God continues to be affected by us. That when we suffer, our suffering actually harms God. And that when we do something to push the world towards a more holy place, that actually brings God joy. And that's a really powerful idea as well. I wanted to end with this last statement. In the 1960s, the conservative movement put out a document called Emet ve'emunah, which means truth and faith. And it was designed to be sort of principles of what it means to be a conservative Jewish person. But really, it was more the conservative movement's idea of what makes a committed Jewish person of any sort of bent. And here's what they say. No matter the level at which one person starts, no matter the heights of one's piety and the piety of knowledge one attains, no one can perform all of the 613 commandments, nor can any person acquire all of Jewish knowledge. But complacency is the mother of stagnation and the antithesis of conservative Judaism. Given our changing world, the finality and certainty are illusory at best and destructive at worst. Rather than claiming to have found a goal at the end of the road, the ideal conservative Jew is a traveler, walking purposely toward God's holy mountain. For me, this is the essence of understanding both Jewish life, but also Jewish understanding of God. That because we can never know God in this lifetime, that we can never fully understand what God is, the beauty of Jewish life is that it gives us both the space and the encouragement and the grounding to ask the questions, what is God? Where is God? How do I relate to God? What vision of God makes sense for the reality that I inhabit? And I will say, as a rabbi, this is a question I get all the time from my own congregants and other people. And people ask me a lot about my own personal understanding of God. And I will say that a lot of times those questions come in times of strife, when people are suffering and want to know, why is God doing this? Want to understand, why is something happening to me? And the truth is, I don't have good answers for those questions. Because my personal belief, and again, this is not me speaking for all of the Jewish people in the world, this is certainly not me speaking for Jewish tradition as a whole, but my personal belief is that not everything that happens in this world is solely because of God's command. If I choose to, hit my brother in the side of his head, it's not because God made me. It's because I made a bad choice and hurt somebody because of my actions. And that part of the design of the universe is that we each have free will, and that if that is to be taken seriously, then even God abides by that as well. That while I do believe in a God that interacts with the universe and is relatable and does reach out to us and want to build relationships with people. I don't believe in a God that, purposefully causes earthquakes to hurt certain people. I believe that earthquakes happen because the tectonic plates in the earth cram up against each other and create force. And that understanding of God is challenging and is difficult and is full of questions that I personally wrestle with at different times, and at other times make me feel incredibly connected and in relationship with the Creator of the world. So that is kind of the grounding and the basis I wanted us to start off with tonight. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I want to make sure that we take a look at some of the questions that all of you have been asking. And I'm going to turn back to our moderator for a little bit of help at going through some of these questions and hopefully providing you some answers as we go.
Thank you, Rabbi Shafrin. That was very enlightening. We have some really good questions. So I'm going to kind of skip around on these questions, if that's okay. I want to first ask, is the God of Jews different from the God who created those who are not Jews? Are we talking about the same unknowable essence, the same creator, the creator of all seen and unseen?
It's a great question. So this is one of those things that the Jewish tradition is actually totally unambiguous about. Yes, they would say that the God of Israel is the God of all creation, that all people belong to God, and that the Jewish people's relationship with God is not somehow better than God's relationship with all other people. It's just a particular relationship. And, the rabbis go so far as to talk about the mitzvot, the Jewish commandments, as being a particular set of values to Jewish people. But if you're not Jewish, those commandments, most of them don't really apply. They have this set of commandments that do apply to the whole world, which they call the 7 no-hide laws, which are things which you would probably say, oh yes, those should apply to everyone, like don't murder people. That's a good commandment to apply to everyone. But the idea of God's relationship, that is universal, and that when Jewish people are praying to God, we are praying to the same God that created the universe, that is everyone's God. So the Jewish people have no claim over God as ours more than other people's.
Okay, thank you. So what does Judaism say about atheists? It says about atheist Jew, but it could be atheists in general.
Great question. So I think most rabbis and scholars throughout any period of Jewish history would say that a connection, a relationship, a belief in God is a foundational Jewish precept. However, like I said before, there's no set of beliefs that make you, by having those beliefs or not having certain beliefs, not Jewish. It's only the actions that make you worthy of, punishment or kind of legal penalties. And so you can be an atheist and be a very, very good, committed Jewish person. In fact, if when I was a student at rabbinical seminary, had said to my teachers, I'm not sure if I believe in God, they would not be mad with me. They would say, that's a great question. You should spend the rest of your life thinking about that. And that's kind of the essence of being a Jewish spiritual person, is that you're not meant to have answers. You're not meant to be able to say like, oh, I know God is this. And I will share personally, I feel like I have had experiences in my own life where I very powerfully felt the presence of God, where I very, specifically in a moment or an experience or in a chain of events felt God's presence in my own life. But those experiences don't make it so that I never doubt, or I never question, or I never feel alone, or I never feel like maybe all those things I felt weren't real. And I think that Judaism not only allows for that flexibility, but encourages the constant revisiting and questioning of one's own beliefs. Partially because hopefully you live a long life and you grow and change over that life. And maybe your understanding of God changes as well because you know new things and you're a new person, but also because understanding God is not the same as like understanding math. 1 + 1 always equals 2, but understanding the nature of the creator of the universe is so much more infinitely complex and also more meaningful that it's worth going back and asking the questions again, even if you felt like you've answered them before.
So someone asks, who then is Jesus to a Jewish person?
That's a great question. And I do not mean to be flip at all or kind of diminishing in the way I talk about Jesus. So Jesus does not exist anywhere in the Jewish foundational text because the Jewish Bible, the Torah, were written 1,500 to 2,000 years before Jesus was born. When Jesus comes on the scene, he's just a person. He was a Jewish person. He was born in the land of Israel that was at the time controlled by the Romans. But there's not a lot of writings about Jesus that were written during his life. So the primary way that Jews interact with Jesus is through the lens of the formalized Christian church. And unfortunately, a lot of the early Jewish experiences with the formalized Christian church were either trying to get them to convert to Christianity or actively persecuting and harming them. And so most of the writings of the rabbis about Jesus specifically were saying Jesus was a person, not the Son of God, not a prophet, not a holy person, specifically to kind of distance Judaism from Christianity. Because in the early days of Christianity, a lot of the kind of ideology around the early church was, oh, this is just Judaism 2.0. This is the next logical extension of Judaism. So Jews, you should stop being Jews and you should be followers of Christ. And on the most part, Jews said, no, we're going to be Jewish. You can do your thing. And that didn't go over great with the early church leaders. And so there isn't really a lot of Jewish thinking about Jesus as like an entity. And it's certainly not part of the Jews' spiritual life.
So since today is the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance, there's a question related to that. In this era of post-Holocaust, what changes happened in Jewish approaches to God, or has there been any changes in Jewish approaches to God post-Holocaust?
That's an amazing question, a very insightful question too. And I will say the answer is yes and no. Yes, there were some radical changes that happened in Jewish thought after the Holocaust. And there was a huge reaction from Holocaust survivors, many of whom either became totally divorced from the notion that there even is a God, or that if there is a God, God is evil, because how could any good and caring God let something like this happen? How could the systematic extermination and persecution of a people be allowed to happen? And some others had the opposite reaction, that say, I only survived the camps because I had something in me that let me keep going when other people just didn't have the strength to keep it going, and died not only because of the horrible conditions they endured, but because of just their lack of will to keep going. And that, faith and connection kept me going. So there are those two kind of polarizing ideologies. I will also say, unfortunately, the Holocaust was not the first time that the Jews have been persecuted. And so this idea of horrible things happening to the Jews, sadly, it's not even out of place. It's not even unexpected. It's something that even today, if you talk to Jewish people, it's something that we're kind of looking for. It's something that we almost expect to happen in a kind of pessimistic way, that like, yeah, things might be good now, but you just know at any time we could be kicked out of a country, because we've been kicked out of most countries throughout history. And so Jewish philosophy on God is less, how could God let this happen? Although there is plenty of that as well. It's mostly, God. I mean, the most popular kind of theology is that God didn't cause the Holocaust. Hitler caused the Holocaust. Hitler made a plan and people carried it out. And it wasn't God's will that 6 million Jews and 6 million others died. It was people who did that. And people need to take responsibility and not just say, oh, God let a horrible thing happen. Lots of horrible things happen in the world. It's sad. Terrible things happen to really amazing people. And it's tragic and heartbreaking. And I personally refuse to let people say to me, those terrible things are just part of a plan. I don't believe that. I think terrible things are terrible. And we have to struggle with that as people of faith, as spiritual people. How do we both hold those terrible things that happen and yet still understand a world that God created human beings in order to be a holy world? It's a very tough and complicated topic.
There's a question from Dr. Phil Cunningham, who's one of our illustrious scholars who will be speaking next Wednesday. And he says, thanks for addressing a lot of complex and subtle topics concisely. What would you say are the subjects about God that you would like Jews and Catholics today to study together?
Oh, man. That's a good question. I have a long list. There'd be great things to be able to study. We're really lucky in my community. We've had this amazing opportunity. We're just about to move into a brand new building, and this building used to be owned by a Baptist church, and they were actually looking to move into a smaller building, so they bought our old building, and we bought their old building and did some renovation on it. So for about a year and a half, we were sharing one building together, and we did a lot of study together. It was fascinating. And I think for sure studying kind of our shared texts, so what a lot of Christians would refer to as the Old Testament, it's so interesting to see how we look at the exact same words and can take very different understandings from those foundational texts that are both totally valid and so beautiful. Those are my favorite things to study. And topics-wise, I would say studying, I think even our shared history is really amazing, because, studying like I was kind of talking about before, studying the formation of the early church from a Christian perspective is really different than studying the formation of the early church from a Jewish perspective. And there's a lot of different, both the way that scholars talk about it in each of those different groups, but also the emotions around it are very different. And I would love to, I like studying history and philosophy anyway, but I would love to be able to kind of have those discussions as well.
And I thank all of you for remaining with us. Well, let's do one more question, and then I'm going to have a few closing words. So someone asked, in Catholic Christianity, there's a hierarchy: priest, bishop, cardinal, pope. It doesn't seem so for Judaism. Each synagogue is an entity unto itself. Would you say that is true?
So that's a great question. Logistically, that's mostly true. So like I said, I am a rabbi who is ordained in the conservative movement. My synagogue belongs to the conservative movement. There is an organization of conservative synagogues. It's called United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism. There's also a union or a governing body for conservative rabbis, which is called the Rabbinical Assembly. And most Jewish movements have those organizing bodies, but they're not the same as like a hierarchy would be in the Christian church, where kind of superiors give orders down to, clergy who are lower on the totem pole. There's a term for rabbis who are, the lead rabbi at their place. It's called the Mara Da'atra. It literally means like the master of, what is said. The rabbi is the one who determines like, this is how we're going to do things. Obviously, we all have synagogue boards and we have other lay leadership, but like that's the essence of being a rabbi and a teacher in your community, is you are the one who is making legal decisions. And so the training you get as a rabbi is not so much, here's what your job is going to look like. It's much more, here is all of the wealth of text and knowledge you're going to need in your head or on your fingertips to be able to make those decisions. And rabbis take very seriously Jewish precedent. So if something has been said in 17 other generations before us, it's really hard to just say like, nope, that doesn't apply anymore. I'm going to do things totally differently. You have to really have grounding and rationale and a reason why you're making that change if you're making that change. But yes, you can see if you come to my synagogue and you come to another synagogue, which is 4 blocks north, which there is another synagogue 4 blocks north, the experience will be very different. And yet you would easily recognize a lot of the commonalities. Even if you just open the prayer book, you'd be like, oh, I see some of these same prayers. But whereas, the experience in one community might feel a certain way, it might feel totally different in another community. So there is a lot of that kind of primacy of custom, of local custom.
Well, with that, there are still some wonderful questions, but we don't have time for all of them today, and hopefully they'll get answered at some point along the way. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed listening to Rabbi Scott Shafrin. We appreciate his sharing his wisdom and knowledge with us this evening. This session has been recorded, and so in a few days you will find this recording posted on the Lux Center pages of the Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology website at www.shsst.edu. The Lux Center is pleased to present 2 more sessions in this webinar series. On Wednesday, February 3rd, Dr. Philip Cunningham of St. Joseph University and Dr. Ruth Langer of Boston College will speak about how should we approach Jerusalem, a Christian-Jewish dialogue. On the following Wednesday evening, Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chand, acting director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., will speak about Christianity and the Holocaust, action and reaction in challenging times. Also, in preparation for Lent, the Lux Center is hosting a webinar that will be a conversation about the book Jesus Wasn't Killed by the Jews, with editor of the book, John M. Sweeney, and book contributors, Sister Mary Boyes, Robert Ellsberg, and Dr. Greg Garrett, which will be held on Tuesday, February 16th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. We hope you can join us. It should be all of these programs we look forward to and should be stimulating. So thank you again, Rabbi Shafrin. Thank you to all of you. We hope to see you again soon, and good night.